What does a king do when he visits the dead? Does he command the ghosts to stand at attention? Does he tally the cost of the marble and granite, assessing the value of his future kingdom of dust? Or does he simply stand there, a man stripped of his crown, bearing a silence heavier than any tombstone? For a king did walk among them. His name was Julian Thorne, and his kingdom was built of concrete, steel, and the quiet, brutal currency of fear. Every Tuesday, without fail, he came. He wore suits the color of a midnight sky, tailored so perfectly they seemed less like fabric and more like a second unyielding skin. He never brought flowers. He never wept. He simply stood before the polished black stone that bore his mother's name, his hands clasped behind his back, his jaw a line of hardened grief. Ilara Vance saw him every time. Her small flower shop, petal and stem, was just a short walk from the cemetery gates, a fragrant, chaotic haven of life against the silent, ordered city of the dead. She noticed him the way one notices a storm gathering on a clear day, a shift in the atmosphere, a sudden drop in temperature. He was an anomaly of severe wealth and severe sorrow in a place where sorrow was common, but wealth was not. She saw the way other visitors gave him a wide berth, their gazes skittering away from the sheer intimidating force of his presence. He was guarded, always, by a mountain of a man named Marcus, who stood by a black sedan that gleamed like a shard of obsidian, his eyes scanning everything, missing nothing. Ilara's world was the opposite of his. It was a world of overdue bills tucked beneath a chipped vase, of the constant, low-grade hum of anxiety for her younger brother, Leo. Leo, whose lungs were a fragile, failing architecture, requiring medicines with price tags that looked like telephone numbers. Her reality was the scent of damp earth on her hands, the feel of worn-out soles on cracked pavement, the exhaustion that settled deep in her bones long after the sun had set. She was a ghost of a different sort, invisible, a woman who worked with her hands, who moved through the city unnoticed. Another face in the crowd struggling to stay afloat on a rising tide of debt and despair. Yet she possessed a quiet, unyielding core of steel, forged in the fires of hardship. She believed in small kindnesses. It was why she often took her slightly wilted, unsellable flowers to the cemetery, placing them on the graves that seemed the most forgotten, the ones no one ever visited. She would whisper a few words, straighten a fallen memorial flag, pull a few weeds. It was a small act of defiance against oblivion. Every life, she believed, was worth remembering. It was on a Tuesday, under a sky the color of a bruised plum, that their two worlds finally collided. Julian Thorne was not alone. A woman clung to his arm, a creature of sharp angles and sharper diamonds. Her name was Isabella Sterling, his fiancée, and she radiated a boredom so profound it was almost an art form. She shivered in her thin silk dress, her heels sinking into the soft earth. "Julian, darling." "How much longer?" she complained, her voice a shrill counterpoint to the cemetery's peace. "It's morbid, and my shoes are ruined." Julian didn't answer. His gaze was fixed on the name etched in the stone. Annalise Thorne, beloved mother. It was the only place on earth he allowed himself to feel the gaping wound of her absence. Isabella sighed dramatically, tapping her perfectly manicured nails against her clutch. Her gaze swept over the nearby graves with disdain, landing on a small, weathered stone marker. A little lamb was carved at the top. "Our dearest Lily, aged 4. "Ugh, look at that one," she said, a cruel little smirk playing on her lips. "So depressing. You'd think if they cared so much, they'd at least keep it tidy. It's an eyesore." The grave wasn't an eyesore. It was simple and old and desperately sad. And Ilara was standing right beside it. She had just finished placing a small, defiant cluster of white daisies in a simple glass jar at its base. She looked up, her hands smudged with dirt, her heart clenching at the casual cruelty of the woman's words. Ilara was not a fighter. Her life had taught her to be quiet, to be agreeable, to not make waves. But there were lines that could not be crossed. The desecration of a child's memory was one of them. She rose to her feet, her movements slow and deliberate. "Every life is worth remembering," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the air with the clarity of a ringing bell. Isabella turned, her eyes widening in surprise, then narrowing in contempt as she took in Ilara's simple, worn dress and dirt-stained hands. "I'm sorry. Were you speaking to me?" she sneered, her tone dripping with condescension. "Who are you? The help?" "I'm someone who believes that a little girl's resting place isn't an eyesore," Ilara replied, her chin held high. That core of steel was now visible, glinting in her tired eyes. For the first time, Julian Thorne turned his head. His focus shifted from the dead to the living. He saw her. Really saw her. He saw the defiance in her posture, the unwavering integrity in her gaze. He saw a woman with nothing standing up to a woman who had everything, armed with nothing but her own conviction. It was the most shocking thing he had witnessed in a decade of violence and betrayal. Isabella laughed, a brittle, ugly sound. "How quaint. The little graveyard keeper has opinions. You should be careful who you talk to, darling. Some people are worth more than others. Dead or alive." She gestured dismissively at the flowers. "And those weeds are hardly an improvement." "They're daisies," Ilara said, her voice still quiet, but now edged with a cold fire. "And they were given with more respect than you've shown in your entire life." The world seemed to hold its breath. Isabella's face contorted with rage. She took a step forward, her hand raised as if to strike. But she never got the chance. "Isabella." Julian's voice was soft. It was the softest, most dangerous sound in the world. It was the whisper of a blade being unsheathed. She froze, her hand hovering in the air. She turned to him, her fury instantly replaced by a sycophantic panic. "Julian, this vagrant was insulting me." He didn't look at her. His eyes, the color of a stormy sea, were locked on Ilara. He saw the smudge of dirt on her cheek, the fierce, terrified pride in her eyes. He saw something pure and unbreakable in a world he knew only as corrupt and fragile. "We're done," he said, the words falling like chips of ice. Isabella blinked. "What? Done with what? Visiting this dreadful place?" "Good." "No," Julian said, finally turning his gaze to her. The coldness in his eyes was absolute. "We are done. You and I. The engagement is over. Marcus will see you home. Your things will be removed from my penthouse by morning. Do not contact me again." The color drained from Isabella's face. She stared, speechless, as he spoke into a small, discreet communications device in his cuff. "Marcus, escort Miss Sterling from the premises. Her access to all accounts and properties is to be revoked. Immediately." The mountain of a man appeared as if from thin air, his expression unreadable. He gestured politely towards the car. "Miss Sterling." Isabella sputtered, a torrent of desperate, pleading words. "Julian, you can't. It was just a silly argument, over nothing, over her." She pointed a trembling, diamond-encrusted finger at Ilara. "She is not nothing," Julian said, his voice a final, damning verdict. He turned his back on her completely, a dismissal more profound than any shout. His focus was entirely on Ilara, who stood frozen, caught in the eye of a hurricane she had somehow created. The sounds of Isabella's protest, which quickly devolved into sobs and then enraged shrieks as Marcus firmly guided her away, faded into the background. Julian took a step towards Ilara. He lifted a hand, his long, elegant fingers reaching for the smudge of dirt on her cheek. He stopped, his hand hovering an inch from her skin, as if he feared his touch would contaminate her. He let his hand fall back to his side. The silence between them was thick with unspoken things. The air smelled of damp earth, rain, and the faint, sweet scent of daisies. "What is your name?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. "Elara," she whispered, her throat suddenly dry. "Elara Vance." He nodded slowly, committing the name to memory as if it were a vital piece of intelligence. "Elara," he repeated softly, tasting the sound of it. He looked from her face to the small, humble grave she had defended. Then his eyes met hers again, holding a strange, unreadable emotion. It wasn't kindness. It wasn't pity. It was recognition. As if he had been searching for something for a very long time, and had just, impossibly, found it. He gave another curt nod, then turned and walked back toward his mother's grave, leaving Elara standing alone, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She had no idea that her small act of courage had just shattered her world and remade it in the image of a dangerous, sorrowful king. The next day dawned grey and drizzly, mirroring the turmoil in Elara's mind. The encounter at the cemetery played over and over in her head, a surreal film loop. The cruel woman, the silent man, the shocking finality of his words. She tried to dismiss it, to bury it under the familiar weight of her daily worries. The eviction notice on her counter felt far more real than a billionaire's broken engagement. Leo's prescription needed refilling. The delivery of roses she'd ordered had been delayed. She was trimming the thorns from a bundle of pale pink roses, her thoughts a tangled mess, when the bell above her shop door chimed. The sound was swallowed by the immense presence of the man who entered. It was Marcus. In the cramped, fragrant space of her shop, he seemed even larger, a monolith in a dark, impeccably tailored suit. He had to duck his head to clear the doorframe. He held a sleek, black leather portfolio. His face was a mask of professional neutrality. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice a deep, quiet bass that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. "Mr. Thorne sent me." Elara's hands stilled. A thorn pricked her thumb, and a single, perfect droplet of blood welled up, a stark crimson against her pale skin. She stared at him, her mind blank with apprehension. "He has a proposition for you," Marcus continued, placing the portfolio on her small, cluttered counter. He opened it. Inside was not a single document, but a stack of them, bound in a way that spoke of immense legal and financial weight. "A job," he clarified. Elara found her voice. "A job? I don't understand. I have a job." She gestured vaguely at the buckets of flowers, the ribbons, the beautiful, organized chaos of her life's work. A life's work that was failing. "Mr. Thorne is aware," Marcus said, his gaze unblinking. "This is a different kind of employment. It is a full-time position. Live-in." He slid the top page towards her. It was a contract. Her eyes scanned the dense legal text, catching on phrases that made no sense. Confidentiality agreement, exclusive service, personal companionship. And then she saw the numbers. Her breath hitched. The salary figure was astronomical. It was more money than her shop would make in 100 years. It was enough to buy the building, to hire the best doctors for Leo, to erase every single one of her crushing debts, and 100 more she hadn't even acquired yet. It was a fantasy number. What is the job?" she asked, her voice trembling. "You would be the personal caretaker and companion for his grandmother, Eleanor Thorne," Marcus explained, his tone level, betraying no emotion. "She suffers from advanced dementia. She requires constant, patient supervision. Mr. Thorne believes you possess the necessary temperament." "Because I was patient with a dead child's memory." The thought was dizzying. "The terms are non-negotiable," Marcus went on, his voice leaving no room for argument. "You would reside at the Thorne estate. All your living expenses will be covered. A separate trust will be established for your brother's medical care and education, effective upon your signature. You would be permitted supervised visits with him twice a month. A cold dread began to seep through the initial shock. Live-in, supervised visits, exclusive service. This wasn't a job offer, it was a gilded cage. And the catch? She asked, her intuition screaming that a deal this good was never just a deal. Marcus's expression didn't change, but his eyes seemed to darken. The catch, Miss Vance, is that your old life ends. You will sign a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement. You will have no unauthorized contact with anyone from your past. Your time, your attention, your loyalty, they will belong to Mr. Thorne. In every meaningful way, you will belong to him. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. You will belong to him. It was possession, a transaction where she was selling not just her time, but her very freedom. The thought was terrifying, repellent. She looked around her little shop. She saw the wilting hydrangeas, the unpaid invoices, the faded photograph of her and Leo tucked into the corner of the cash register. She thought of her brother's labored breathing, of the quiet panic in his eyes when he struggled for air. She thought of the eviction notice that promised to make them homeless in 2 weeks. What was freedom when you were shackled by poverty? What was choice when all your options led to ruin? Julian Thorne was offering her a prison, yes, but it was a prison where her brother could live. Her current life was a prison where he might die. When framed that way, there was no choice at all. She picked up the pen. It felt impossibly heavy in her hand. Her signature, when she wrote it, was a shaky, spidery thing. The signature of a ghost signing away her own existence. Marcus took the contract, his movements efficient and precise. A car will be here in 1 hour to collect you. Pack a single bag. Everything else you require will be provided. He turned and left as quietly as he had arrived. The bell chimed his departure, a sound that felt like a death knell. Elara stood alone in her shop, the scent of roses suddenly cloying and funereal. She looked at the drop of blood on her thumb. A deal sealed not in ink, but in blood. Her blood. Her life. The Thorne estate was not a home. It was a statement, a declaration of power written in glass, black steel, and pale, unforgiving stone. It rose from a manicured landscape of severe green lawns and strategically placed sculptural trees, looking less like a house and more like a private, modern art museum that had been weaponized. The driveway was a mile long, winding through a dense forest that was clearly owned and patrolled. A high, electrified fence was visible through the trees. Fortress was the only word that came to mind. Elara sat in the back of the silent, opulent car, clutching her single worn bag. She had made one call, to the social worker overseeing Leo's case, and explained the situation in the vaguest possible terms. A wealthy benefactor, a live-in job, a trust fund. It had sounded like a fairy tale, and the social worker's skepticism had been palpable. But the money, when it was instantly verified, had silenced all questions. The car glided to a halt before a set of towering glass doors. Marcus opened her door, and she stepped out into a world of profound, intimidating silence. The air was different here. Colder. Thinner. The interior was even more sterile than the exterior. Vast, open spaces with soaring ceilings. Floors of polished concrete that reflected the grey light from immense, floor-to-ceiling windows. The furniture was sparse, architectural, and looked profoundly uncomfortable. There were no photographs, no clutter, no signs of life. It was the mausoleum of a man who was already dead inside. A housekeeper, a stern-looking woman in a crisp grey uniform, led her to her rooms. The suite was larger than Ilara's entire apartment and flower shop combined. It had its own sitting area, a cavernous bathroom of marble and chrome, and a bedroom with a wall of glass that overlooked a severe, zen-like rock garden. It was luxurious and soulless. Her first meeting with Eleanor Thorne took place in a sunroom that was the only space in the house that held any hint of warmth. The old woman was sitting in a plush armchair, her gaze distant, fixed on something only she could see. She was small and bird-like, with wisps of white hair and Julian's stormy grey eyes, though hers were clouded with the fog of time. "Eleanor," the housekeeper said gently. "This is Ilara. She's going to be spending time with you." Eleanor's head turned slowly. She looked at Ilara, her eyes focusing for a brief, lucid moment. "Annalise," she whispered, her voice a fragile, papery thing. "Is that you, my dear? You came back?" Annalise. Julian's mother. Ilara's heart twisted. "No," she said softly, kneeling beside the chair so she was at eye level. "My name is Ilara." "It's a pleasure to meet you, Eleanor." The moment of clarity passed. Eleanor's eyes unfocused again. "The roses," she murmured. "We must prune the roses before the frost comes." For the next few weeks, Ilara learned the rhythms of the gilded cage. She learned the geography of Eleanor's mind, the paths it took into the past, the triggers that brought on confusion or fear, and the small things that brought her moments of peace. She discovered that Eleanor had once been a passionate gardener. The sterile rock garden outside her suite was a cruel joke. Ilara found a forgotten, overgrown greenhouse at the far end of the property. With Marcus's reluctant permission, she began to restore it. She ordered soil, seeds, and pots. She started bringing Eleanor there, letting the old woman run her gnarled fingers through the rich, dark earth. It was a breakthrough. In the greenhouse, surrounded by the scent of dirt and growing things, Eleanor became calmer, more present. Ilara taught her how to pot seedlings, their hands working side by side. Sometimes Eleanor would share a fragmented memory, a story about her husband, a childhood anecdote, a mention of her daughter, Annalise. Ilara listened to them all, piecing together the history of the cold, silent man who was now her keeper. Julian was a ghost in his own home. She rarely saw him, but she felt his presence everywhere. She knew he was watching. Sometimes, from the corner of her eye, she would see him standing on a high balcony overlooking the greenhouse, a dark silhouette against the sky. She would check the security feed on the tablet in her room and see that the cameras in the sunroom and the greenhouse were always active on his main screen. He was observing her, studying her, like a scientist studying a strange new organism introduced into his sterile environment. One evening, unable to sleep, she wandered into the vast, two-story library. It was filled with thousands of books, none of which looked like they had ever been read. She ran her fingers along the spines, a lonely ache in her chest. She missed her own small, dog-eared collection of paperbacks. "You can read them, you know," a low voice said from the shadows. She jumped, spinning around. Julian was standing by the fireplace, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. He was in his shirt sleeves, his tie loosened, the first chink she had ever seen in his armor. "I didn't mean to intrude," she said quickly. "This is your home now, Ilara," he said, his voice flat. "Nothing is off limits." He paused. "Except my office." An awkward silence stretched between them. "Your grandmother is a wonderful woman," Ilara said, trying to fill the void. "She was," he corrected, his voice tinged with a bitterness so profound it made her shiver. "Now she is a collection of fading memories." "She remembers her garden," Ilara offered softly. "She remembers love." His eyes met hers across the cavernous room. His gaze was intense, searching. "You have been good for her," he stated, as if it were an undeniable fact he had observed and recorded. Better than the nurses. They treated her like a patient. You treat her like a person. She is a person, Ilara said simply. He took a slow sip of his drink, his eyes never leaving hers. He was fascinated by her simplicity, her sincerity. In his world, everyone had an angle, a hidden motive. Kindness was a currency used to purchase favor. But hers was genuine. It was a foreign language he was slowly, painstakingly, beginning to understand. He took a step towards her, then another. The space between them shrank, and the air grew thick, charged with an unspoken energy. He stopped just a few feet away. He could smell the faint scent of potting soil and lavender that always clung to her. It was the smell of life. "Why did you do it?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "In the cemetery. Why did you defend that grave?" She didn't have to ask which one he meant. "Because no one else was going to," she answered honestly. "Because everyone deserves to be remembered with dignity." He stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. It was as if her answer was both exactly what he expected and something he couldn't possibly comprehend. He gave a single sharp nod, as if she had passed some unspoken test. Then he turned and walked out of the library, leaving her alone with the silent books and the loud, frantic beating of her own heart. Their quiet, fragile world was built on a fault line, and the tremors were about to begin. The catalyst was a man named Dmitri, Julian's cousin and his second in command. Dmitri wore a smile like a well-tailored suit, but beneath it, his heart was curdled with jealousy. He had watched Julian inherit the Thorn Empire, had served him loyally, all the while believing he was the more deserving heir. He saw Ilara not as a caretaker, but as a new variable, a potential queen who threatened his position. Her quiet influence over Julian was a lit fuse, and Dmitri decided it was time to set the whole damn thing on fire. He made a call to the Petrovs, a rival family whose ambition was matched only by their brutality. He gave them everything: security codes, patrol schedules, the layout of the estate. He told them about the charity gala Julian was hosting, a rare event that would bring all of Julian's key people under one roof. It was the perfect opportunity for a decapitation strike. The night of the gala, the estate was transformed. The cold, sterile spaces were filled with music, soft lighting, and the low hum of conversation from the city's elite. Ilara, at Julian's quiet insistence, was in attendance. He had a dress delivered to her room, a simple, elegant gown of deep emerald green that brought out the fire in her hair. She felt like an imposter, a dove in a den of exquisitely dressed wolves. She stayed close to Eleanor's side, keeping the confused old woman calm amidst the noise and the unfamiliar faces. Julian was a whirlwind of controlled, menacing grace, moving through the crowd, his presence a constant silent assertion of dominance. But his eyes kept finding Ilara. A glance across the room, a brief, intense stare that made her feel like she was the only person there. The attack came without warning. The music screeched to a halt. The floor-to-ceiling windows on the far side of the ballroom exploded inward in a shower of glittering, deadly confetti. Men dressed in black tactical gear poured in, their weapons raised. Screams erupted. Chaos bloomed like a blood-red flower. Marcus and Julian's other security moved instantly, forming a protective cordon. Julian himself became a different person. The cold businessman vanished, replaced by a lethal predator. His movements were fluid, economical, and utterly deadly. In the ensuing panic, Ilara's only thought was Eleanor. She grabbed the old woman's hand, pulling her toward a service corridor. "It's all right, Eleanor," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "It's just a game. We're going to a quiet room." But Dmitri was there. He had been waiting for this moment. His face was pale with a sick, triumphant sweat. He moved to grab Eleanor. "She's my ticket out of here," he snarled. Ilara reacted on pure instinct. She shoved Eleanor with all her might toward a small alcove hidden behind a tapestry, a panic room she'd discovered weeks ago. "Get in!" she screamed. The heavy door swung shut just as Dmitri lunged. He missed Eleanor, but his hand closed around Elara's arm. At the same moment, one of the Petrov enforcers, a hulking brute with dead eyes, saw them. He saw the way Julian's gaze kept flicking toward the girl. He saw his opening. He shoved Dmitri aside and grabbed Elara, yanking her back against his chest. The cold, hard circle of a gun barrel pressed against her temple. "Thorn!" the man bellowed over the sounds of gunfire. "Drop it, or your pretty little bird gets her wings clipped." The world stopped. Julian, who had just disarmed an attacker with brutal efficiency, froze. He turned. He saw Elara, her face white with terror, her eyes wide and locked on his. He saw the gun at her head, and in that instant, the architect of ruin felt his own foundations crack. The cold, impenetrable fortress he had built around his heart didn't just crack, it was obliterated. All that was left was a primal, terrifying fear, the fear of losing her. His face, always a mask of cold control, became a canvas of raw, unadulterated panic. His breath hitched. His knuckles were white where he gripped his own weapon. For the first time in his adult life, he was not in control. He was helpless. "Let her go," he said, his voice a ragged, desperate thing he didn't recognize as his own. The gunman laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. He started to drag Elara backward, using her as a human shield. "Not a chance. You and I are going for a walk." Elara's mind was a maelstrom of terror, but through the fear, she saw Julian's face. She saw the agony there, the vulnerability. She saw that this man, this king of a violent world, was breaking because of her. And a fierce, protective instinct she never knew she possessed roared to life. He had saved her. Now it was her turn. As the gunman dragged her past a marble pedestal, her eyes latched onto the heavy, bronze sculpture of a falcon that sat atop it. It was now or never. With a guttural cry, she stomped down with all her weight on the gunman's instep. His grip loosened for a split second as a jolt of pain shot up his leg. It was enough. Elara twisted, grabbing the bronze falcon with both hands. It was heavier than she expected, but adrenaline was a powerful fuel. She swung it with a desperate, primal force, smashing it into the man's knee. There was a sickening crunch of bone and cartilage. The man screamed, a high, piercing sound of pure agony, and his leg buckled. He stumbled, his hold on her broken, his aim thrown wild. The single shot he fired went harmlessly into the ceiling. The distraction was all Julian needed. He moved like lightning, a blur of dark motion. 2 precise shots, and the threat was neutralized. The gunman crumpled to the floor. The ballroom fell into a sudden, shocking silence, broken only by the whimpering of the wounded and the distant sound of sirens. The attack was over. Julian's men had secured the perimeter. The Petrovs had been ruthlessly, efficiently annihilated. But Julian saw none of it. He had eyes only for Elara. She stood, trembling, the heavy bronze falcon still clutched in her hands, her knuckles white. Her chest was heaving, her emerald dress stained with dust and grime. She was terrified, but she was standing. She was alive. He ignored the bodies. He ignored Marcus, who was trying to give him a situation report. He walked across the debris-strewn floor, his steps sure and unwavering. He stopped in front of her, his stormy eyes searching her face, checking for any sign of injury. She let the statue fall from her numb fingers. It landed on the plush carpet with a soft thud. He reached out, his hands framing her face, his touch surprisingly gentle. His thumbs stroked her cheeks, as if he were reassuring himself that she was real, that she was whole. And then he kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was not tender or romantic. It was a desperate, brutal claiming. a raw, possessive act born of terror and relief. It was the kiss of a man who had stared into the abyss of losing the only thing that mattered and had, by some miracle, been pulled back from the edge. He poured all his fear, all his rage, all his unspoken, unacknowledged feelings for her into that single, desperate act. He broke the kiss, resting his forehead against hers, his breathing harsh and ragged. "I thought I lost you," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion she had never heard from him before. It was raw, stripped of all artifice. "I thought I lost you." He pulled back just enough to look into her eyes, his own blazing with a fierce, protective fire. "Listen to me," he commanded, his voice low and intense. "They will never touch you again. Anyone who tries, anyone who even thinks of harming you, I will burn this entire city to the ground to get to them. Do you understand me? Never again." She could only nod, her heart pounding a wild, frantic rhythm against his. In the midst of the carnage, surrounded by death and destruction, she had never felt safer in her entire life. He looked down at her, at the woman who had faced down his fiancé over a forgotten grave, who had calmed his grandmother's troubled mind, who had just risked her own life to create an opening for him. He saw her not as an employee, not as a caretaker, but as his anchor, his light, his queen. "The contract is finished," he said, his voice raw with conviction. "It's void, torn up, burned." He took her hand, his grip firm and unwavering. "You are not my employee. You are not a prisoner in this house. You are everything." He paused, his eyes searching hers, willing her to understand the magnitude of what he was saying. "You stay because you choose to stay, but you are never leaving my side. You are my partner, my equal, from this moment on." It was in the quiet, bloody aftermath, as Marcus and his team were securing the estate, that the full depth of the betrayal was revealed. Marcus approached Julian, his face grim. He held up a shattered smartphone recovered from one of the lead attackers. On the screen was a series of messages, a digital trail of treachery that led directly back to one person: Dimitri. Julian looked at the screen, his expression hardening from one of fierce protection to one of absolute, Arctic cold. The name of his cousin, his own blood, glowed like a poisonous thing. The betrayal was intimate, a knife twisted in a wound he hadn't known existed. Dimitri had not just tried to kill him, he had willingly, knowingly, put Ilara in the line of fire. He had used her as bait, and for that, there was no forgiveness. There was only retribution. The purge was silent, swift, and total. Julian Thorne became the monster the underworld had always whispered him to be. He did not rage. He did not yell. He moved with the cold, relentless precision of a surgeon excising a cancer. The Petrov family was not just defeated, they were erased. Their businesses were dismantled, their assets absorbed, their key members vanished from the face of the earth, leaving behind nothing but cautionary tales whispered in hushed tones. The final piece of the purge was Dimitri. Julian found him hiding in a cheap motel on the outskirts of the city, a pathetic creature stripped of his fine suits and false confidence. He didn't send Marcus. He went himself. He entered the small, squalid room. Dimitri scrambled backward, his eyes wide with terror. "Julian, I can explain," he stammered. Julian stood by the door, his hands in his pockets, his posture relaxed. It was the most terrifying thing Dimitri had ever seen. "No," Julian said, his voice quiet, devoid of all emotion. "You can't. You put her in danger. You pointed a gun at my heart by pointing it at her." He looked at his cousin, at the man he had grown up with a terrifyingly calm disappointment. "I could have forgiven ambition. I could have understood greed. But you threatened what is mine. You tried to take the one good thing in my life. and use it as a weapon against me. He shook his head slowly, a gesture of finality. That I cannot forgive. He turned and walked out of the room without a backward glance, closing the door softly behind him. He didn't need to see what happened next. He heard nothing. Marcus was an artist of silence. The city held its breath. The criminal underworld, shaken by the swift and brutal totality of Julian's retribution, fell into a state of terrified obedience. The Thorn Empire was more secure than ever, its foundations now cemented with the blood of its enemies. 6 months passed. A time of quiet healing and rebuilding. The shattered windows of the estate were replaced, the scars of the attack erased. But the house itself was changing in more fundamental ways. At Elara's direction, the cold, sterile rooms began to breathe with life. Vases of fresh flowers appeared on stark tables. Soft rugs covered the cold concrete floors. The rock garden outside her suite was torn up and replaced with a sprawling, vibrant English garden, a riot of colour and fragrance. She had brought life back not only to the house, but to its master. Their intimacy, forged in the crucible of violence, deepened in the quiet that followed. They spent their evenings in the library, not in silence on opposite sides of the room, but together on a comfortable sofa she had insisted on buying. She would read aloud to him, her voice a soothing balm on his scarred soul. He would watch her, a small, genuine smile often touching his lips, a sight no one else in the world had ever seen. He learned the contours of her past, the story of her parents, her fierce love for her brother. She learned of his, of the mother he adored, and the cold, demanding father who had forged him into a weapon. They were two broken halves of a whole, fitting together in the spaces where the other was damaged. Leo was thriving, enrolled in a specialized private school with the best medical care money could buy. He was a different child. His laughter during his now frequent and unsupervised visits to the estate echoed in the halls that had only ever known silence. He adored Julian, who treated the boy with a gruff, surprising tenderness, teaching him how to play chess and listening intently to his endless stories about space exploration. The final piece of their transformation was ready to be unveiled. The city was hosting its annual Founders Gala, a pinnacle of the social calendar. It was the kind of event Isabella Sterling once lived for, the kind of event Julian always endured with cold disdain. This time, it was different. This time, he wanted to go. He wanted to show the world his queen. When Elara came down the grand staircase, Julian was waiting at the bottom. He was in a perfectly tailored tuxedo, a vision of dark power. But his eyes, when they landed on her, were filled with nothing but awe. She was breathtaking. She wore a gown the color of liquid starlight, a shimmering silver that clung to her form. Her hair was styled in soft waves, and a simple, elegant diamond necklace, a gift from him, the first piece of jewelry she had ever accepted, rested at her throat. But the most stunning thing about her was not the dress or the diamonds. It was her confidence. She was no longer the invisible, struggling florist. She was Elara Thorn, a woman who knew her own worth, who stood beside the most powerful man in the city, not as a possession, but as a partner. She radiated a serene, unshakable power that came from within. He took her hand, his thumb stroking her knuckles. "Ready?" he asked, his voice a low murmur, meant only for her. She smiled, a brilliant, genuine smile that reached her eyes. "With you?" "Always." Their arrival at the gala caused the entire ballroom to fall silent. Whispers followed them like the train of a gown. They saw the shock, the speculation, the envy. Julian Thorn, the Cold King, the architect of ruin, was holding this unknown woman's hand as if she were the most precious thing in the world. And she, in turn, looked at him not with fear, but with an open, unadulterated love that seemed to soften his sharp edges. They were a portrait of devastating power and unexpected grace, a king and queen taking their rightful place on the throne. Later in the evening, as they stood near the terrace, a young waitress, no older than Ilara had been when she'd had her shop, nervously approached with a tray of champagne. Her hands were shaking, and as she passed them, she stumbled, sending the entire tray crashing to the floor. Glasses shattered. Champagne soaked the expensive rug. The girl froze, her face draining of all color. The gala's host, a pompous, cruel-eyed man, descended upon her like a vulture. "You clumsy idiot," he hissed, his voice low but venomous. "Do you have any idea how much that vintage cost? You'll be paying for this for the rest of your miserable life." The girl began to tremble, tears welling in her eyes. It was a scene of public humiliation, a powerful man crushing someone powerless for sport. It was the world as Julian had always known it. But it was not Ilara's world. She gently disengaged her arm from Julian's and stepped forward. She placed a calming hand on the terrified waitress's arm. The girl flinched, expecting another blow. Ilara looked at the host, her expression not angry, but firm. Her voice was quiet, yet it carried an authority that made the man fall silent. "It was an accident," she said simply. "It's fine. We will cover the cost." She then turned her full attention to the girl, her eyes full of a kindness that was a weapon in its own right. "Don't worry about it," she said, her smile genuine and warm. "These things happen. Are you all right?" The girl could only nod, tears of relief now streaming down her face. Julian watched the entire exchange, and a slow, real smile spread across his face. He saw her power. It wasn't like his, the power to break, to intimidate, to destroy. Hers was the power to heal, to protect, to mend. She had walked through his world of darkness and had not lost a single ounce of her light. She had not become a queen of ashes. She had become a queen of grace. He stepped to her side, sliding his arm around her waist and pulling her close. He looked at the still fuming host. "As she said," Julian stated, his voice carrying a deadly quiet promise, "it's fine, and this young lady will be treated with respect for the remainder of the evening. Am I clear?" The host paled and nodded vigorously, bowing his way back into the crowd. The final scene of their story was not in a grand ballroom or a corporate high-rise. It was in the garden Ilara had built. Weeks later, under the warm glow of a setting sun, they sat on a simple wooden bench. The air was sweet with the scent of jasmine and roses. Eleanor was with them, sitting in a comfortable chair, humming a tuneless, happy song as she carefully deadheaded a rosebush. She was peaceful, content. Julian wasn't looking at a stock portfolio on a tablet or taking a call about his empire. He was looking at Ilara. Only at Ilara. He reached over and took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. He was a man who had commanded armies of men, who had built an empire of fear, who had lived his life in a fortress of his own making. He was the architect of ruin. But here, in this garden, holding this woman's hand, he was finally home. He had found his humanity in a graveyard, in the quiet defiance of a woman who tended to forgotten souls. She had walked into the ruins of his life and had planted a garden. The monster was not gone. It was still there, sleeping, ready to rise and defend his queen at a moment's notice. But it was no longer who he was. He leaned over and kissed her, a kiss that was soft and deep and full of promises that no contract could ever define. It was the kiss of a king who had finally found his kingdom, not in the spires of the city, but in the heart of one unbreakable dove.